It is always a treat to be back with you all. As I was, first off, it's Northern California and I'm a little cold, so I took my jacket off. I'm gonna have to preach really hard today to stay warm. The gift of a community where like a good chunk of you have been in my living room and I've been in many of your living rooms creates a culture that brings me so much joy, and it's a different experience than any other place I speak throughout the year. And so, thank you for being that kind of welcoming community. And today, I want to actually. This is not like stump speech. Like I'm not coming in with like a thing that I am going around communicating to everyone. This was more of a morning of reflecting on the things I'm really wrestling with personally at the moment and feeling safe enough in this community to process that together. And so I want to invite you into some of my process and see what we might make sense of together, or what questions might remain that we can continue to ask together. We're in this moment, which is less a moment and more a season, I think it's safe to say, where it's very easy to feel a sense of despair and frustration and even anger at the state of things. Whatever that state of things might be. We could look at it from like a political level or economy that's shifting, or the state of our neighbors who are feeling so much fear and anxiety right now, or maybe it's something personally in your life. But there is a temptation to shrink, at least for me at the moment, and move towards despair, move towards either despair or a combative posture with those maybe I'm struggling with, and jumping into conversations where we're just kind of bouncing off each other's triggers because things are so heightened and so reactive. And in these moments, I can feel, and I think we can feel, like it's just kind of gray outside. And in the reality is, what we know is true, at least in our heads and probably deep within our hearts, is it's actually, there's so much beauty and so much color and so much delight that gets covered up by the clouds of despair. Here's an observation I'm making, and this is going to frame how I'm processing a couple familiar themes this morning, hope and joy, which we've probably talked about billions of times in communities like this. But I'm observing many of my neighbors. Those of you that have been in our neighborhood know we live in a neighborhood that's primarily a neighborhood of immigrants, many of whom are undocumented. And there is a palpable sense of fear and anxiety. There's been lots of lived experiences that affirm why that fear and anxiety exists. But something else I'm observing is that community is modeling to me a level of resilience, a level of presence, a level of joy that I'm just unfamiliar with. I'm convicted by and I'm inspired by all at once. And so I want to look at this a little bit. How is it that the community that's most impacted by broken policies and can live with the most anxiety and fear for a future is also living with this kind of unorthodox, countercultural hope and deep, abiding, profound sense of joy? Two of our dearest friends in the neighborhood are both undocumented, and they have 5 kids, and they have had quite an experience that we've been able to accompany them in regards to their status, one of them having been deported and us having the gift of sitting with them, and then thankfully they're back in our neighborhood. But here was the moment that led to this sermon. We have every year a celebration called Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, which is a very common celebration in cultures of those in our neighborhood, Latino culture. And we talk about All Saints Day, or Halloween, obviously, is kind of the big cultural one. Day of the Dead celebrates our ancestors, those that have crossed the veil, what we have to learn from them, how we remember them. And one of the practices is you set up altars to remember these family members, these saints in so many ways. We want to remember their legacy so we can live what we learned from them. We can honor them beyond the veil. It's a beautiful practice that our family has really grown to love. So our neighborhood has what's called a processional that runs for about an hour and a half through the neighborhood to different altars. Different families have been invited to set up an altar in their front yard. And it's like a holy invitation. Our family was asked to host an altar this year. And so my wife does what she does. She makes like this beautiful altar celebrating grandparents and friends and others who have passed. On this evening, about 300 to 400 people from the neighborhood gathered for this processional. In the front of the processional are native Aztec dancers and who hold this kind of ritual ceremony throughout the neighborhood. Our house is the last one on this about an hour and a half processional. And as they're coming up the street, I can see Alma in like full dress for this moment, glowing with joy. Her kids are at the front of the dance group, like the Aztec dancers. And then her husband, Alma, comes to our front gate, of which I open. He gives me a huge bear hug. They bless our ancestors as we collectively continue our procession. And as I was looking at each of them in the eye, I just thought, these are two people who have every reason to shrink in fear, to be overwhelmed by despair, to be turned to anger. Yet there is something about them that's still showing up in these moments with some funky version of hope and some very tangible expression of joy. Within Latin American theology, there's this concept of lo cotidiano, which is a theology of the everyday. Some scholars in this theology would say that it's a theology of the abuelitas, of the grandmas. They don't have a PhD from Stanford, they have a PhD in everyday life, they would say. It's a theology from below, not just one from academia, not just one that remains in our heads and is aligned with dogma. It's a lived theology within the context of struggle, pleading with God to show up in the midst of that and trusting that hope and joy can be found in the midst of that. It's that theology from below, this theology of the everyday that I think is embodied in Alma and Romero, and that I want to wrestle. I want that to be our kind of theological framework for how we talk about hope and joy today. Where is this coming from? What do we need to learn from this body of experience in theology about how to show up in this moment where we can be plagued with despair and withdrawal and with anger? How do we face the reality of today by practicing hope and cultivating joy? In 2014, there was yet another active war in Israel and Palestine. I spent about a decade very active in peace-building work in that region. And one of the primary ways that I showed up there was to highlight and learn from and support the peacemakers in that region. Israeli, Palestinian, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, incredible people working beyond and within the borders, ideological, theological, political, physical borders in that region. To support them, encourage them, and then to learn from them and have their insight shape the way that we practice peace back here in the United States. One thing that was clear in 2014 is our partners there were profoundly exhausted, deeply traumatized, and in need of retreat. If you live in a conflict zone, it's really hard to function as your best self. And so we were able to rally some support and some visas to have Israelis and Palestinians come together at this resort town, essentially on the eastern side of the Dead Sea in Jordan, just outside of Amman, Jordan. And one evening, we're all together sitting in a circle, and I ask the question, where are you finding hope? Are you finding hope? And I'll never forget the response of one woman. Her name is Manar. She's a Palestinian Christian, lives in Bethany, the town of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, a town of resurrection. she looks at us and she says, in moments of intense conflict, when the tear gas is coming through the front doors, I take my kids into the kitchen and we dance. When we don't have hope, we create it, she said. That was her direct quote. When we don't have hope, we create it. That's the collective of peace builders. Jeremiah 29, verses 4 through 7 is a text of political theology. How many of you guys have heard Jeremiah 29:11? Maybe on an embroidered pillow or an incredible, artwork on the wall. No, there's no shade to that. That's beautiful. It's a great verse. It talks about a hope and a future that is promised us. Oftentimes we read that text in the context of our own personal stories, which I think can be a helpful way to read it, especially in times of pain and struggle. But the text is actually written to a community of people who have recently been deported, been exiled to Babylon. A group of people Israelites who were at home in Jerusalem, had things relatively well put together. They had a rhythm of worship and life and work, and they were then taken into Babylonian captivity. This is a text written by a prophet speaking on behalf of God to a community who had lost everything. A community who was under the yoke of occupation and asking, what does our future look like? What do we do now? What do we do in light of our current situation? There's every reason to shrink, every reason to fear, every reason to be angry. A prophet in the chapter before this, chapter 28, comes to those people and says, actually, God's got a word for you. You're going to be good. It's going to take about 2 years. You'll be back in Jerusalem, good to go. God then says to Jeremiah, you need to go and let them know the truth. The truth is, you're going to be here for a while. You're not coming out of exile in 2 years. So instead of thinking this is all going to end, you actually need to get comfortable and learn how to live well in the midst of the struggle. And now we'll read the text, Jeremiah 29, 4 through 7. So these are some verses leading up to that famous 29:11 verse that many of us are familiar with. The Lord of heavenly forces, the God of Israel, proclaims to all the exiles I have carried off from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Cultivate gardens and eat what they produce. Get married and have children. Then help your sons find wives and your daughters find husbands, in order that they too may have children. I'll read off mine. Increase in number there so that you don't dwindle away. Promote the welfare, or some translations say the peace of the city where I have sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because your future depends on it. Jeremiah doesn't say it's all good. He says, get comfortable. To a people in desperate need, desire for freedom, for liberation, the prophet says, get comfortable. Learn how to live faithfully in that place. Learn how to find hope in the midst of a seemingly external hopeless situation. Make a home. Have children. Contribute to the peace of the city. How do you live faithfully? How do you live joyfully? How do you live present in the midst of pain and displacement and occupation? How do we live in the midst of our conflicted times with hope and joy? One of my mentors, especially in relation to how to show up faithfully in these times, named Brian McLaren, recently said to a collective of us that were with him, we were talking about hope. He said, hope is doing the next right thing. Hope isn't just an idea about a future. Hope is actually practicing. It's living. It's doing the next right thing with an uncertain future. You don't know if it'll quote unquote work, but we know what the next right thing to do is. Do it. practice. Hope is a practice. Hope is dancing in the kitchen. Hope is living in Babylon and practicing making the decision for the next right thing. What does that look like for us? I think of the story of the disciples post Jesus' crucifixion. This is a community of people whose hope was in this Messiah, right? They were finally going to bring us out of exile. We did it. He dies. What does hope look like? What's the next right thing to do for them when hope is lost? Hope has literally been killed. And then you find them walking along a path, and someone who surely seems a lot like that source of hope walks next to them as Jesus' resurrected form begins to accompany them into a new future. But what did it look like for them? What was the source of hope post-crucifixion? It looked like moving towards community. Trusting that the empire that killed and crushed Jesus would not have the last word. It was doing the next right thing as we wait, as we get comfortable. This is not like a cheap hope. You've maybe heard the language of cheap grace. This is not a cheap hope. This is a costly hope. This is a practiced hope. It's resilient. It stares reality in the face. It's not sticking our head in the clouds, but it does the next right thing anyway in the face of that. Hope believes transformation is possible despite the circumstances. It trusts the slow work of God in ourselves, in our world. So the next question we ask then is, what sustains our hope of doing the next right thing? How do we actually practice hope, and how do we do it for the long haul? We are not robots. This is not merely a cerebral activity. We have to practice something. We have to cultivate something in us that allows us to continue to do the next right thing, to practice hope in the face of despair or temptations of anger and withdrawal. I would argue, and what I'm observing, is that joy has something to do with that. I'm defining joy as the emotion of living from the true self. Joy can only be found when we are living fully who we are created to be, unencumbered by social expectations or egos or our need to prove or perform. Joy comes from being exactly who we are. So what is this currency of joy? How does it inform how we practice the next best thing to hope in the midst of these difficult times? Desmond Tutu, you've probably heard of, is someone who struggled within apartheid in South Africa, an incredible justice hero. Last year, I met with his biographer, Michael Battle, and he was sharing about Tutu, and he said that he would pray 7 hours a day. Like, I don't even know how that works on the clock exactly, if that's like a 4 to 7 a.m., and then... But this is what he did. And there was something about that cultivated this infectious joy while leading in the midst of a socio-political mess. Every reason for anger and despair. There's stories of Tutu meeting with the Dalai Lama, maybe some of you have heard of them, where they would tickle each other with laughter. These two spiritual giants in the midst of social struggle would engage with each other. There's a quote from their Book of Joy that says, "They giggled like mischievous schoolboys, tickling each other until tears ran down their faces." Joy in the midst of struggle. Struggle doesn't just mean anger. It doesn't just mean withdrawal or despair. Tutu would say, laughter was an act of resistance. Joy is a defiance against despair. This is the joy I saw in Alma and Romero's eyes as they walked into our front patio. There was a resistance to the reality they're facing in this moment. As Romero, oftentimes when I'm standing in the school line dropping off our kids, talks about the fear that they're living in right now. They can no longer watch the news, and every time he drives home from work and doesn't face ice, he prays to God a prayer of thanksgiving. And yet he finds joy. For the Dalai Lama, laughter was a practice of non-attachment and compassion. I am not so attached to the externals that it compromises my ability to be fully me and have joy come from that place. Their friendship modeled what they called the moral power of joy. In Luke 15, you all have probably heard of the story that's sometimes called the story of the prodigal son. This is Jesus giving a parable, or the faithful father. Jesus is talking to a group of religious folks who are upset with him for hanging out with sinners. And Jesus shares this story, of which I'm not going to retell in its entirety, but in short, one of the sons asks for his inheritance early. The other son is faithfully by his father's side. The son who gets the inheritance goes and spends it all, and then is terrified of coming back to his father to say, I blew it, will you take me back in? As the son begins to move back towards his father, there is this moment in verse 20 that I think is a beautiful picture of joy of the father. While he, the son, was still a long way off, but now coming back to his dad, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. His father ran to him, hugging him and kissed him. The son comes back, and what does the father do? Very countercultural, through the stigmas. A patriarch does not run in this context. It would require lifting your robe, exposing your legs, which is a sign of shame. The father is so filled with joy. He doesn't care what people think about him. He lifts his robe and he begins sprinting to his son, who would have, in that context, needed to experience shame and kind of grovel. Before the son can experience any of that, this father is already hugging and kissing him. Joy is fueling. The father is living purely out of his belovedness, out of his at-homeness in God's love for him, and inviting his son into that space. When we live at home in ourselves, when we live out of that place of deep love, we are freed up to experience joy even in the midst of so much pain. I had this experience last year that was like maybe my number one experience of my own joy, witnessing my daughter live out of her joy. So my middle child, her name is Rosie, and she is in 7th grade now. Last year in 6th grade, she had a terrible injury. She's a dancer. She is alive with dance. That's what she does. She gets up early to stretch and do yoga and to write in her journal and be ready so that after school she can go to dance class. And this is like her thing. Well, as she was practicing one day, she was doing the splits and fractured her pelvis. It was horrible. It happened at school. We had to go over there. We had to run her into the ER. And she was in so much pain. And it was right before the beginning of her dance season that she'd been working towards, all those early mornings and through all this training and discipline to make it happen. And she was destroyed. One other piece that she had been working towards was in her PE class in 6th grade. They were tasked to get in groups and then give a dance that they would create in front of their classmates. And that was like, she was stoked because that's what she does. So her and her friend River had been working on a dance. And this was a week before they were going to perform it in front of the school. And her friend River said, I'll do the dance by myself. And this is 6th grade. Middle school is rough. Go dancing in front of a school by yourself is terrifying. So the brave girl said she'd do it. Rosie, my daughter, could not fathom her dancing alone. And so she said, I'm going to dance with you. I'll adjust the dance so I can do it in my wheelchair. And so the morning comes of this. I don't know what to expect, but I'm able to go. And I record this dance. And I want you to watch it. And I want you to observe what it looks like to live from deep within ourselves, out of that place of home, and what joy can come from it in the midst of struggle. So if we can play the video. Whew. I wept my brains out as I watched that, and she was so embarrassed because I could not stop crying in front of all of her friends. Irish theologian and poet John O'Donohue talks about that as us living unfurled. That we can be furled, like picture sails of a sailboat kind of in harbor. We are invited to unfurl ourselves towards a new beginning. Unfurl ourselves into fully being who we are. To fuel us, to allow us to live out that joy despite circumstance. That gives us the ability to practice the next right thing. To practice hope in the midst of struggle. A piece of this poem for a new beginning says, unfurl yourself into the grace of a beginning that is at one with your life's desire. Unfurl yourself. Imagine whatever it is, when you feel like you're holding in the despair, the fear, the anger, the desire to prove something. What if we release that and unfurl ourselves to the grace of beginning that is at one with your life's desire? Awaken your spirit to adventure. Hold nothing back. Learn to find ease in risk. Soon, you'll be at home in a new rhythm, for your soul senses the world that awaits you. When we are at home in ourselves, we are free to unfurl, to experience joy, and to practice hope. I think this is the deep spirituality and theology of the everyday. Of those that have been struggling in Babylon or in today's society, who show up with resilience, who don't turn to anger and cynicism and resentment, but turn to joy and to kindness and deep conviction and struggle for justice. This is a unique magic sauce that we have, that I think some have tapped into, that we are to learn from and seek to embody ourselves. I describe this as a politics of hope and joy. Politics not just as a partisan thing, politics simply as how we engage society, how we order society. Instead of a politics of fear, a politics of despair, a politics of anger, what might it look like to live a politics of hope and joy? To learn from this theology from below in the midst of struggle and exile and heartbreak. And to live a joy that roots us in the now, the freedom of now. We are always free to live fully who we are. And a hope that draws us towards the not yet of renewal, but allows us to have the ability to take the next right step, to dance in the kitchen. Hope and joy form the rhythm of a liberated faith. It's not constrained by the politics of the day or the circumstances of the day. It's a liberated faith, and it allows us to embody an alternative politics to fear and anger. Joy without hope can quickly become complacency. Oh, I'm just joyful, but I'm not actually doing the next right thing. I'm not actually struggling for justice in the midst of society. It can become a personal self-actualization project without the collective. Hope without joy can just become exhaustion. I have been in and experienced so many that are struggling for justice in our world, who are doing the next right thing, but then get so burned out because they're fighting like this, white knuckling. They're not actually tapping in to the joy. They're holding on, and it's so easy to move towards resentment and towards burnout and towards a performative faith. So when we hold them together, hope and joy, they can cultivate a resilient and authentic discipleship, what it looks like to follow Jesus in the midst of struggle, in the midst of exile. Reverend Stephanie Spellers, she once said, we are to be people who live and love at the intersection of where our hearts sing and our eyes weep. We are to be people who live and love at the intersection of where our hearts sing the joy and where our eyes weep. And how do we do the next right thing in the midst of that? May we be those people. May that this community be that community. May I seek to continue to learn from those neighbors who are modeling this alternative politic of hope and joy and integrate it into our practice, both in solidarity with and for our own flourishing and healing. Will you stand as I offer a blessing? Friends, family here at New Community Church, who again I've had the gift of having in our home. I look forward to having more of you in our home in a few months. Thank you for the welcome of this space. May we go into this world rooted in hope. The hope that looks at the complexity of our moment and chooses to do the next right thing. May we live from a deep joy, a joy that rises when our true, unfurled self is free to breathe and bless the world. May this hope and joy become our alternative politics, a way of being that resists fear, refuses cynicism, and restores what is broken. And may the Spirit empower us to run toward others with courageous love, embodying the kingdom already breaking into our conflicted world. Amen.